So friends, so far we have gone into the genesis of the essay in English history, and it starts broadly in the late 16th century, and Bacon, is there at that time, an established personality, authority, and he has to explain things to other people, but then he has also to ask questions from himself. So that's how the essay initially originates, if one can use that word, and then in the 17th century, the essay becomes much more evolved towards the ending of the 17th century, when there is an effective English parliament where the crown has lost all its dignity and splendor, and the power structures have changed hands. Now they are in the hands of the merchants, people with money, and it is they who will make the mayor go, so to say. And then immediately after that comes the 18th century, when the merchants have finally started ruling the roost. And they have started also telling writers as to how a new kind of England has to be formed. The England which would be equivalent to the Augustan period in the Greek and the Roman time, when it was a great period. So there is called the Augustan age also. So on the one side Augustan, on the other side Mock. So because you can't be an Augustan person or a personality in the age of mercantilism. So it's a strange kind of a thing, and mockery and taunting people and pulling their leg and all those things, they are also equally important. And the 18th century is the kind of breeding ground of this kind of attitude, and then at some point of time this attitude is to be tempered by writers. They have to find some points there, and this is the process that Professor Richa Bajaj entered into, and finally started laying bare the roots of the English essay in this expanse of time. So now the points that she would have to take up for discussion have to do with a kind of novel that emerged, a new form in literature. This form was not there, and so Professor Bajaj, has novel something to do with the essay in the 18th century?
Yes, certainly. I think we have to really understand that the novel came up around the same time, or grew around the same time as the essay in the 18th century. But the idea is that both the novel and the essay in fact were this kind of specialization of genre wasn't there in the 18th century, right? So there was this kind of a literary tradition where there was a blend of the personal and the social, and in fact you find that the English essay in many ways it challenged the borders between fiction and non-fiction, and that's something which one must be aware of, that how is the English essay different from, say, any other scholastic or any other scholarly essay. You see, most novels were written during this period. They sought to straddle between fact and fantasy, right? Presenting themselves as historical accounts. So even the novel presented itself as a historical account. Think of, for instance, Daniel Defoe's The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, right? So there is a sense that there is a kind of a history being laid out there. For instance, when Samuel Richardson wrote Clarissa, he called it Clarissa, or the history of a young lady, right? So basically what I'm trying to say here is that the novel and the essay were in a way intertwined in many ways, and the kind of strict categorization that we have today of disciplines, or that occurred in fact in the 18th century or beyond the 18th, particularly in the 19th century, when the novel became novel and the essay became the essay. Before that, they were in a way constantly straddling between the two. Particularly the English essay was literary in its form, in the sense it would take up a fictional character, and it doesn't claim to be a history, right? It tries to enter the zone of fantasy. More often than not, these the writer would take a pen name or a pseudonym and go on writing under that name, and build an essay which had a literary characteristic. So there'll be a character portrayal. So there is a lot of imaginative strokes that are there in this kind of essay. It's not a kind of a treatise, It's not a kind of treatise that was written, for instance, in the Europe, by Erasmus or Bacon, or even before that by the theoreticians that you had in Greece or Rome. So this is a form that is deliberately using imagination, that is deliberately delving into fantasy to create a sort of a real non-real sort of a piece, right? So it, in fact, that's why I said that it challenged the borders between fiction and non-fiction, because it was constantly going towards fiction, just as fiction was constantly going towards fact, claiming itself to be a history, right? So later in the 19th century, the novel became more fictional, and more purely fictional, you could say, and the essay became very plainly critical, right? But their shared roots in the Enlightenment cannot be missed. That the Enlightenment period, in the Enlightenment period, they have the shared roots of coming up from the same value system. Now, in the mid 18th century, then the essay actually emerged as a very as a literary form in which cultural values were stated. So it carried the tradition of classical rhetoric was introduced, and we have to remember that this is also the time when the liberal arts are becoming a part of education, and there is an interest in the reading public about the current affairs, right, as also about what the writers have to offer around culture. So what I'm really trying to say here is that the novel and the essay, they have shared roots, and that they come from the same place, and both are trying to be real and non-real at the same time, which means both are straddling the fact and the fantasy at the same time. The essay is trying to be imaginative and fictional, and the fiction, the novel, is also attempting to appear as an essay or as a document or as history. So there is no clear-cut category that emerges, that later takes shape in the 19th century between the essay and the novel. In fact, the essay and the novel are in many ways drawing from one another aspects that each has. So that's what I would like to say about the novel and the essay. What do you think?
Can I ask a question at this particular point, in the discussion? Is essay a secular genre? What do you say?
You see, the periodical essay actually supported the Whig regime at the Whig party. So in a way, they were trying to go with the cosmopolitan or the more open-ended sort of a viewpoint and not go into the Tory. So in a way, it tried to bring out the secular sort of vein in through rationalization. You see, there is a reason why we call 18th century also the age of enlightenment and the age of reason. Now, the age of reason per se means that you are going to use the yardstick of rationality and use that in every aspect of life, whether it is to do with tradition, and tradition, also tradition. You see, the class that is coming to the fore has nothing, the tradition has nothing to offer it, right? The merchants and the traders that we spoke about, who come to the fore with the setting up of the parliament, the new people who are now becoming rich in the 18th century, find that the past really has nothing to offer it, which is why the need for a new genre, which is why poetry in a way dwindles into this kind of aristocratic exercise and is mocked at and is looked at superficial. I mean, you had a pope writing an entire book on the lock of a lady, right? So you find that both the play in that sense, and poetry in that sense, they are becoming redundant for the new class that can no more express itself in verse and wants to develop a genre that would assist it, which in this case happens to be the novel and the essay, because it speaks directly and speaks about very specific points that are important to the people at the time. And because it is, it's obviously trying to take some important points from tradition, but it is not based on tradition, it is not based on religion, it is trying to reinterpret religion, and I think in that sense it is more secular because it gives space and a very open space to different points of views, particularly the essay. If you once we get into this series, we will realize how the essays are constant, they are self-conscious, they are constantly talking about what is their purpose, why they are writing, what they attempt to do, and to what extent they might be found useful. There is a sense of, there is no pedantic sort of clarity that they have. They are in a way themselves finding feet in this new waters, I would say. So in a way they are self-conscious and they are trying to portray their worth to the reader, and for some reason the reader appears to be more powerful than the writer in this case of the essay.
Now, you have talked about the concerns of the essay, and those concerns are the 18th century concerns. And just a little before now, you also mentioned the title of the novel, Clarissa.
Right.
And the title was long. So, would you like to comment on the long title?
The history of the youth.
The woman.
Yeah. Yeah, so history of a young girl. So in that sense, you see, what I'm trying to say is that it is the history of a woman that is being projected, right?
And for the first time in English literature.
Yeah, but projected as history,
yes.
Right? So there is an emphasis on, for that matter, the history of a particular person, which becomes more important than the history of an age or a history of a particular social group. Because this is, and who is this woman? She's an ordinary woman.
And she's
right?
being groomed in society.
Right. So the grooming is what the 18th century, I think, is all about. The 18th century is all about grooming the people. It is, and the essay is also trying to do. It's grooming people to be the kind of the desired subject of a country. So I think they use this by writing this essay. They are using personal reflection and social critique. Right. So the Tatler that comes out in 1709 onwards, or the Spectator, which is there from 1711. There is the Rambler, the Idler, right, the Lounger, and then all these periodicals that came during this period, they were written again from coffee houses. Right, so they were produced by people who were part of the chocolate houses and coffee houses circuit.
Not from the churches.
Not from churches, yes, that's true. From clubs, right? From chocolate houses, from coffee houses. Already these are places where you are indulging. Already these are places where people would laugh and they would become the stock of somebody's ridicule, right? So the periodical essay, I think, in that sense is situated in a place, and their geography actually is very interesting as well, because they are set in different, in many ways you could say that this essay is also a kind of history of London. It's very interesting because I think that they are situated in these different corners, and each time these writers would pick up a particular place and then lampoon it or tell us what the culture of the place is. Just say, you think of Grub Street, for instance, right? So the Grub Street is not a part of these discussions, because they stay, but it always is there. It always serves as a point of a comparison, right, as a point of ridicule, as something that London is not. So we are looking at the very clear London circles here, and I think by bringing these places, the writers also offer a sense of history and culture of London that is evolving during this particular period. This is what. So it outlines, in fact, the towns, the diversity of the towns, the culture of the time that was a kind of a melting pot of both the high and the low life. So if there was wit, there was obscenity as well. So there is wit, obscenity, there is culture, there is high life, low life. So in a way, it becomes a melting pot of all these. For instance, there are lampoons on places like Lincoln's Inn Field, the Old Bailey, the Drury Lane that we know of, Lombard Street, and St. James coffee houses. Many of these socially symbolic as geographical locations, many of these spaces. So geographical spaces become sort of places where these accounts are told, and also accounts where that will give us a sense of history and culture of the region. For instance, I would also like to mention here that in the opening number of the Tatler, Steele announced that all accounts of gallantry, pleasure and entertainment that he would write would be dated from White's Chocolate House. And then he said all discussions of poetry and the arts will come from Will's Coffee House. Then he says all learned commentary from the Grecian, and all observations on foreign and domestic news will come from St. James. And miscellaneous thoughts, he says, will come from my own apartment, whose location, like the location of the resident or the writer, is unidentified, right? So what I mean to say here is that there are these places that become important locales, and in a way they are mapped out in our minds as places that symbolize something.
Would you call them the soul of the English essay?
The places, the geographical places,
yes,
I
yes.
think so. They are, I mean, if not soul, then they are integral to it, certainly. In the sense that, because they are also fictional, right? You know, fictional and not fictional, because he's going to create, there are actual places, and these actual places will then become the harboring or point of from where these essays would emanate. And you know, so I think it's integral to understand London, its culture. You know, we often associated it with high literatures without realizing that there was so much of vulgarity and obscenity also going around where there was wit. So I think these writers tried to bridge that gap, and in a way when the high and the low come together, you know, that's when the space becomes more secular. I feel that this is important, because when the high blends with the low life, that is when the real it gets its kind of life force, and and at the same time its dynamism, and I think that's what leads to a kind of a more secular space.
From secularism to democracy is how far?
I think you know, England is already on its way to a kind of a more democratic model, with the Parliament coming into place and fighting for itself, and the civil and the kind of English revolution that occurred in the 17th century. So I think it has already entered a very democratic space, and by the time you reach the 18th century, but there is a sense of elitism still there in the 18th century, right? Because we are again speaking of people who visit coffee houses, etc., and the coffee house culture then goes on till T.S. Eliot. You know, by that time it has become completely isolating, a place which only consists of scholars. But in the 18th century, it is more like a place where people come together, you know, and you know, share ideas, but also have fun together, and it's a place of pleasure and I think enlightenment alike. So I think it's not a serious business anymore, this idea, the things about ideas, and you know, and where manners are also included, all of those. So I think it's not so, developing the self or self fashioning in that sense is no more a serious business for the 18th century people. They like to go into the light-hearted, in a light-hearted manner about it, even when they're talking about aesthetics and principles of aesthetics, even when they're trying to develop modern taste. I think all these have to do with you know, with inculcating them in everyday life.
So in a way you are suggesting that England is producing not scholars and intellectuals, but ordinary masses who believe in enjoyment and entertainment.
I think there's a lot of social climbing that is happening, because from the ordinary masses there is a group that is emerging which has become important, and now it needs to be made, now it needs to be polished. Right now they need to be groomed. So I think this particular period sees a kind of blend where the gentlemen have probably come down to the level of this group, and the new class have risen that requires you know, they are going to be the face of the country, so they better be groomed and polished now. And so there is a class of writers who are ready to give them direction and offer them a sense of taste and modern sensibility. So there is a modern sensibility that is emerging, but not along crass ideas, but trying to be more refined about it. In fact, let me quote this particular critic, who's you know, he's the editor of this book, very interesting book, which is called The Great Age of the English Essay. His name is Denis Gigante, and he says here that, and I quote, the periodical essay in Britain reflects a moment when literature was less sharply distinguished from other forms of writing, such as journalism, philosophical speculation, private memoirs, letters, travel narratives, and sermons. But the distinguishing feature of the sort of ephemera is their literary dimension. They try to be literary at the same time. Then he goes on to say, the essays filtered historical and socio-political critique through the lens of character and narrative voice. Right? So in a way, again, there is a character, a pen portrait that is built, and a narrative voice which looks like the novel, but then it is about it's a critique on a historical aspect or a socio-political aspect. So Gayante goes on to say, from the beginning, and I quote, from the beginning, the dual purpose of the periodical essay in reporting news, foreign and domestic, was to entertain and to reform the reigning morals, manners and tastes of the time. unquote. So I think this is in a sense what the English essay stood for. That on one hand, these essays were meant to report news and foreign or domestic, or talk about these aspects. On the other hand, it was and to entertain, but it was also to reform the morals and the manners and tastes of the time. So I think these together would make this kind of an English subject that we see coming to the fore by the end of the century. And they have this kind of their objective was to teach readers how to read critically, for instance, and at the same time how to, and the essay had a very freewheeling sort of form, right? It would go in all directions, it will take up anything under the sky, but it had always a historical and cultural framework within which it worked. So I think that is what defines in many ways the English essay, that there is a kind of historical curiosity. The periodical essay was in many ways, according to Gigantes, it was in many ways a precursor or a forerunner of the literary studies and cultural criticism. He says that all the literary studies and the literary criticism that we later speak of, its roots can be seen in this kind of an essay form that actually taught people how to read critically and to articulate their thoughts in a particular manner by using a very literary sort of characteristic, which is to do using character, narrative voice, etc., but talking about history. It's very interesting. The novel takes up the form, style of a history, but is all fiction. The essay takes up the style of a narrative, but is all real, is all fact. So I think that's something which is very interesting about the English essay, that there is a literary tradition that is being built by these essays during this period. So I think that's how I would look at the English essay genre per se.
Are you a votary of the English essay, which talks about the ordinary things with a sense of entertainment and gossip and journalism, or of high kind of culture, which talks about psychological exploration and all those things in the 19th century? What is your take?
So I think for me, both serve the same purpose. They are both trying to convey ideas that they find are necessary for people. One takes the garb of ridicule and freewheeling, etc., and hence more dangerous maybe, because you tend to think that it's just freewheeling, and you tend to think that there's really nothing, it's just a humorous sort of an exercise. But when you approach a scholarly essay which you think will give you some psychological truths, you go with the understanding of learning, and you think that you're going to learn something today. But when you approach the English essay, you don't think you're going to learn something. You in fact go with the idea of something interesting out there. Something humorous is coming your way and you want to be entertained. So you're going with the expectations of being entertained, and the writer is very aware of this expectation. But then with entertainment, I think alongside entertainment, a whole code of conduct or manners, dispositions are being parceled and given to you in the form of just a humorous exercise. So I think I would be a little wary and be more cautious while going to a humorous essay than to a serious exercise. What do you think? What is your take?
So you would say that essays actually belongs to the comic mode. The mode, that there is a lot of imagination, there is a lot of entertainment, that there is gossip, that there is pleasure, and that people relax while reading or writing an essay.
At least the English essay, was meant to be that. That was its purpose. That it didn't want to be it didn't want to be all the heavy stuff, etc. It wasn't going to be like. It wasn't also going to be like the Restoration era periodicals, which were bawdy. They were talking about gossip and scandal. So let's also distinguish this 18th century genre. It is intellectual in nature. It is not the Restoration style periodicals that were which talked about gossip and they would talk about scandal and talk about all obscenities. There is wit there, and I think that wit rescues it in many ways. There is intellect involved. It was a polite mix of it was catered to the middle class readers. Restoration era periodicals were not catered to the middle class readers. They were catered to a dying, decadent, aristocratic group. But the 18th century periodical essay is addressed to a mixed audience of middle class readers who would like to become sophisticated and would like to become refined and would also like entertainment, because they are not pure scholars out there. They are not the readers of Bacon. So, and they are not would-be philosophers, right? They want to be entertained, but they also want to become refined in their manners. So, I think there is an strong intellectual strain in the 18th century periodical essay, which is missing in the Restoration, and the serious essay somehow does not take into account the comic mode. So, I think it's a happy blend of the comic and the intellectual. That's how I'd like to put it.
Would you agree that essay actually belongs to the anarchic attitude in life?
Why anarchic?
Because it is going astray. It is bringing in so many things, and it is not offering any kind of unity. It's not.
But there is no unity in life. It picks up these diverse aspects of life and just picks them as, I think what it does, it abstracts a particular truth. Maybe that's why you call it anarchic, because then you can't connect it with other things, and it appears to be in itself just talking about an aspect. But and that's its abstraction, maybe because it may become like one-off thing, but I think I don't see it as anarchic. I think it as if you have just zoomed in on an experience and laid bare the dimensions that exist within it.
So anarchic is not there. This is something poised against order, against discipline, against bureaucracy. It's the assertion of the human, the defiant.
Yeah. So, in many ways, the periodical essays actually, I think, behave more like a friend or a confidant. Again, not a philosopher who was going to give you the nugget of truth today and you've come to this philosopher, but as a, address the reader also as a confidant, and address the reader in the private space. In the private space of somebody's bedroom or a study, and etc. You see, these periodicals would reach people's homes. Obviously it was a business venture, so they had to also plead people to subscribe to their periodical and spend some time. And in fact, in one of the introductory speeches, Steele said that you should use it as your cup of tea every day. So you should make it a part of your tea table, right? And the tea table also became another then periodical that came up. Yeah, so it wanted to become a part of one's lives.
It's a kind of snack when you.
Yeah, so you wanted to become a part of people's everyday lives. Like you would have conversations, so you would converse with, listen to a friend through the page. It was more like that. So I think it's a more relaxed sort of a manner in which they approach the reader, and is very chatty in its way. It's not it's not like some authorial voice of this powerful authorial voice which is going to take you to the darker depths of life, or not even this kind of sincerity that you see in the romantics like Hazlitt and De Quincey. When you have their essays, then you see them talking about very strong sense of passionate engagement, but these people also lack that. So there is a sense of objectivity and moderation that they employ. So I don't see them as anarchic. I see it as as where literature actually becomes a companion, or where the periodical becomes your companion and your confidant, and you're sharing that moment when you're having your tea with this writer who has some interesting notes to share about life and somehow connects it with your life, right? So we do have these humorous columns in newspapers all the time. I think we can relate it to, on the editorial page there is the editorial that is meant to be all serious, and then on the sides you have this kind of a column which is the non-serious or the humorous one.
The middle on the editorial page.
Or even on the editorial page, you, for instance, you had Khushwant Singh, for instance, right? So there is humor involved in mixed with news and political items.
So if you have a column, that column has 3 or 4 episodes. So independently, all those episodes are the essays.
Right, right, absolutely, and that was the length of the essay, also the English essay, I think, and I mean, it's about modern sensibility and wit that they finally brought.
So friends, in this lecture, Dr. Bajaj has covered a very vast area of English writing, particularly with respect to the essay that was originated, it evolved and finally took definitive shape. And these are all pointers to the lectures that will happen after this, and different scholars from the university, there are 3 or 4 of us who are just running this series, they will be taking up the specific essay writers, specific themes of the essays, and dilate upon the importance of what is called the English essay. So this is just the pilot kind of discussion, pilot project, and let's see how it opens up and how it makes an intellectual space in your life that will be for all of us to see. So with that particular idea that the English essay is to be recognized, it is to be understood, and it is to be also followed to a certain extent, that will be the aim of the series. Thank you.